Ladies and gentlemen, when Jan Gehl was a young architect in Denmark in the 60s, the architectural fashion was to build big functional apartment buildings in the suburbs and not to care too much about the people who lived in and around those buildings. The space between the buildings was not thought to be important. In 1971, Jan Gehl published a landmark book, Life Between Buildings, a book that was translated into English only in 1987. As a thinker of public space, Jan Gehl has been ever since an advocate for livable cities, observing streets and the transition from public space to the private sphere. His ideas have played a major role in the transformation of Copenhagen from an automobile-dominated city to a city for pedestrians and cyclists. So I owe to Jan Gehl the fact that I came here from my hotel on a bicycle. He has been called by numerous cities, London, New York, Melbourne, among others, to advise them on the transformation of their streets and of the city planning. Professor Gehl is Emeritus Professor at the Royal Danish Academy for Fine Arts and the head of Gehl Architects. He has received numerous awards. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Jan Gehl.
Oops, it works. Some years ago, I was at a conference in England, and there was this architectural critic, Ken Walpole, and he said something I thought was very precise. First, I should say, as you have heard, I'm an architect. But this guy stepped up there and took an object and said, I feel so sorry for you architects, because your mean of communication is the still photo and the two-dimensional drawings, and that has led to all of you being completely obsessed with form. But this is not architecture, this is sculpture. Architecture is the interaction between the form and the life, and only if the interaction works, it's good architecture. To describe my career as a researcher, I've been on my knees studying this all the time, and it has certainly not made me very popular in many architect circles, because everybody thought that I should take more interest in this, and this was waste of time. Let's see. I have, as mentioned, been in academia for a long time, and I have been doing research throughout my career. And in this way, I have met a number of people from other professions who have told me their viewpoints on architects and research. One of them, or some of them, would say, you architects, you start by dropping the solution out of your sleeve and then spend 3 months after to argue that this is a good solution. Another one would say, we doctors, we are a profession, because on the most extensive evidence, we draw the most limited conclusions. But as opposed to you architects, who on the meager evidence draw the most wide-ranging conclusions. I'll tell you, let's see if it works. Here we are. I will tell you briefly the story of my life, though you have been so kind to highlight some of the things. I graduated as an architect 52 years ago from School of Architecture in Copenhagen. And that was, I realize now, that was the worst time of city planning ever. And there was really a crisis of architecture. That was the days and times when modernism was strongly influenced. So the whole study time I had in architecture school, we learned to be good modernists. And we learned from Corbusier that cities are bad and freestanding buildings are good, streets and squares are bad, grass is good, and he called this high-rise the vertical garden city because everybody could see some grass. Later on, they could only see the parked cars in front of the house. I rushed out of School of Architecture and was prepared to do all these wonderful modernistic things. Then I married a psychologist. And then at once in our family, we had lots of young architects, lots of young psychologists, and all the time they were saying, why are you architects not really interested in people? But you influence people's life a lot, and you learn nothing about people in School of Architecture. And we would say, oh yes, but your aesthetics and whatever, it's very important for people. Yeah, but that's this much. So I had to go back to School of Architecture. I spent another 40 years in School of Architecture to find out what I didn't learn in School of Architecture. And what I really worked on personally was to make the people who use the buildings, the people who use the cities, make them visible, find out ways of finding out how people were using the things we do, how the interplay between physical form and life was going on, and try to systematize it and have methods of documenting life in the cities. And as told, that ended in this little puny PhD book, Life Between Buildings from 71. Then, much to my surprise, I saw in the years to come that the books were spreading. It took a while, it took 15 years before it came out in English, but then it has spread all over, and it and many other books are still being published in all kinds of funny languages. I am especially proud that this little PhD study from 1971 about how to cater more precisely for people in city planning has now been distributed and are used in a number of developing countries. And I'm very proud about this, and that gives an old man a humbling feeling to know that these people found this kind of humanistic city planning research useful. Also, of course, I'm proud that all my books are out in Chinese. And I know that they are widely distributed because I think that I've signed all of them. And then I have a great sorrow in my life that they have never had time to read them over there. But one may think that given time, they would start to read and we will have a better world even in China. At some point, 15 years ago, so many people came, mayors and developers, they came and said, you can criticize us for being inhuman in our city planning, but couldn't you come and show us how to do it yourself? And then I had to form a company where we have worked, in 15 years, we have worked increasingly from one end of the world to the other because there are so few people, so few companies which specialized in advising about how to treat people better in city planning. So up north you will find Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. Down south you will find Christchurch, where we helped them with the rebuilding after the earthquake. There's Shanghai, there's San Francisco, there and especially many cities in Australia and New Zealand. And it's been fantastic to see this enormous interest worldwide for this kind of humanistic approach to city planning. I have some blank slides here and there. That means I change subject. Then a couple of years ago, in the recent years, I've had a very nice sponsor. That's a stinking rich Danish foundation who approached me at some point and said, we think this humanistic city planning is very, very interesting. How much money do you need? And then we got money to have a research center, and then they came again and say, couldn't you sit down and do a book and write down everything you know while you can still remember it? And then I said, I have no time, I'm too busy. And then they said, isn't that a matter of how many assistants I can give you? And then at a certain point, they said, oh, I have enough now. Now I have time. So we made this book, and much to my surprise, in just 3 years, it's out in 25 or 24 languages, and the most funny languages they are also. As you will see, after 40 years, we even have now one of my books in French. It is not published in France, though. It is published in Montreal, but anyway, it is in French. And there's also here a book in Greek, and when they came from Greece and say, we would like to publish your books, I said, no, you should use your money for something better. Don't publish my books. And then they said, no worry, we get the money from Danish embassy. So they have it in Greece, and even the ambassador said they need very fast to learn how to walk and bike down here in Greece as part of their recovery. In this book, I mentioned very much looking back over the 50 years I've been in the profession. I look very much and see that there was around 1960 some very important changes of paradigm. Suddenly, everything took off in new directions. One change of paradigm was the invasion of the motor cars, and very soon all the existing spaces in the old cities were completely full of cars, pushing the people out of the spaces. We also know that the traffic problem became a major problem in all cities, and all cities at once had a traffic department who had excellent statistics of everything about traffic, how much traffic, how many cars going here and there, how much parking, everything they knew. And when there was new planning, they were very fast to say, we have statistics here, we have prognosis, we need 6 lanes here and 4 lanes there. So they had a fantastic influence on planning. But do you know of any city who has a department for pedestrians and public life? And do you know of any city who has systematic records about how the city is being used by people? That certainly was not part of the agenda, but it has become part of the agenda now. But in this big paradigm shift towards automobilism, we saw that the traffic was celebrated. And we also saw increasingly that the conditions for people in cities all over the world were being eroded, and more space were taken over, people were pushed out. We also saw that the cars and the cheap gasoline completely changed the way we did our city districts. So now we could spread everything out, and we had this fantastic infrastructure based on cheap gasoline. One of the big problems with the paradigm of the motorism was that we suddenly started to introduce a completely new scale in our city planning. In the old days, we had always 5 km/h architecture, an architecture based on the human being, the speed we could walk, what our senses could take in. The spaces were small, there were people in the spaces. It was very sensual and interesting, and it made walking very, very nice. But now suddenly we had architecture, 60 km/h architecture, huge spaces, huge signals, no people, no details, you can't see it anyway. And this was a part of this great confusion about scale which has happened in this period of the last 50 years. The other change of paradigm, which dates back from around 60. Actually, it dates further back. But in around 60, it really took off. That was the paradigm of modernism, which became dominating at this point. Modernism, of course, was very serious business, because these guys, they defined that everything had to be changed. We have a new man now. We shall do completely new cities. This is the radical plan for Paris. take down Paris and build 24 high-rise buildings, put all the Parisians in these 24 high-rises, and they will be happy ever after. This was some of the kind of thinking which was around at that point. What happened around the world was, around 60, the city started to grow really in earnest. And the planners, to overview these new districts and have room to think and whatever, they sort of started to hover over their models, and they moved the objects around like this to see, and virtually they went up in aeroplanes and started to plan from aeroplanes, and it looked very nice from the aeroplane. The site planners, they sort of were moving around at rooftop in helicopter perspective and did the fine adjustment of the ensembles. And what happened at that period was that nobody was asked to look after where people were. So the people scale was completely abandoned. The landscape architects didn't do much, the architects didn't do much, the planners didn't do much. There was nobody really realizing that this new way of planning actually was the most efficient way of killing life in public spaces which had ever been invented. I call this way of planning the Brasilia syndrome, and that's named after the capital of Brazil, where they had a big competition in the 50s, and they had this fantastic plan of Brazil, that Brasilia was an eagle, the head was the parliament, and the wings were where people were living. And they had also, so from the airplane, Brasilia is wonderful. And also, if you are down in rooftop in a helicopter, it's still very interesting with these monuments and buildings which are placed very carefully with big parks. It's fantastic. Brasilia is wonderful. Except when you are down in Brasilia, then the people scale is completely neglected. Actually, Brasilia, as far as I'm concerned, is shit. And people are asked to walk endlessly and they don't get anywhere. The grass is crisscrossed by shortcuts, and down at eye level, nobody thought about. Maybe they thought all Brazilians would each have a helicopter so they could enjoy their capital, but they don't. This kind of Brasilia syndrome we can follow today also. We can follow it many places. In quite a bit of extent, I think that the Danish new town Ørestaden in this city is part of a late Brasilia syndrome. But a place like Dubai is completely full of freestanding buildings, and it may look wonderful from the air, but down in Dubai, it's not very nice. Also, we started to have what we call the bird shit architects, who fly in from all over the world and drop their towers. And we have the star architects who have to make a tower in each city. And we have, and you don't get a city by having enough towers, because what is important is how the towers land in the city and what spaces are formed, how it is, what the quality is down where the people are. It's not a matter of many towers or specific towers. Here is a typical planning situation. You can see the usual suspects hanging over the model and moving about. And down there, you can see from a Dutch city, and you can almost hear them say, we have no oval buildings. Oh, for God's sake, have you got one? Let's make some oval ones. And look at those those cubes over there. Couldn't we turn them 45 degrees? Ah, that's good. So we turn them, and then you can start to wonder about a Dutch mother with 2 kids on her bicycle going through this landscape and enjoying this. So clearly, many city plans have been made without any concerns for the spaces. In the old cities, we had spaces, and the buildings were lining the spaces. It was streets and squares. In the new towns, we have in-betweens. We have leftover space after building. First you do the buildings, then you have leftover space, then you call the landscape architect, say, can you do some landscaping here? Then you open the window and see if there's any life there, and there's no life. there. So we have all over the world, we have these examples of modernistic planning where everything is blown. And also again, we have a question, a problem of scale. We had the old human scale made for the body, and now we have the ability to build enormous big buildings, to mass produce buildings, and always, inevitably, we overscale things and make too much space for too few people. Confusion about scale. Here is a new Chinese town called a charming new city. And I was told that it was charming because they originally thought that Main Street should be 120 meters, but they have reduced it to 90 meters. So now it is charming. But it is a sign of this enormous confusion about what is a good human scale. It should be said that at the time of the modernists in the 60s, there was no knowledge that the built form would actually influence the life of the cities. It was believed that life will just go on, but people will be more healthy because now they have toilets and running water and fresh air and grass. But actually what we had to, everything which was known about good city building, which had been developed through centuries of human settlements in cities, that was thrown out by the modernists. And then came a period where we painstakingly had to start from scratch and find out how does a built form influence people's life. The first alarm was raised by Jane Jacobs, a journalist living in Greenwich Village. She was in serious fight with the planners from New York who wanted to take down Greenwich Village and Soho and Little China over in Little Italy in the central part of Manhattan to get a new, very, very smart trans-Manhattan freeway and build a number of high-rise because Greenwich Village was terribly outdated and had to go redundant. Jane Jacobs fought it vigorously. She actually won that battle, and she put down all her experience in the book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she said, if the modernists and the motorists are to plan our cities in the future, it is farewell to the great cities and welcome to the dead cities. She was actually very precise. She also said we must look out of the windows and see how people use cities to come to know something about what is important in cities. And that is not freeways and high-rise. That is maybe the corner store and the butcher standing in the door and talking to the kids in the street and whatever. Go out there and see for yourself, said Jane. Throughout this period of 50 years, there is very little evidence that modernistic building, housing areas or city districts have ever been popular. The world is full of evidence of that people really doesn't like them. They don't feel at home here, and they have all these kind of cartoons. Here, it's sort of more symbolic. In this one from Australia, it's more to the point, and also they have an idea about who may be responsible. Then, of course, as an architect, I could have dreamed that my profession would have been out there fighting vigorously for the sake of the people and pointing out that whatever we built had great influences on people's life. I think what has happened in the global world is that increasingly architects have started to compete on form. There's been more and more focus on form, and we can distribute the form in digital pictures and in all kinds of media. So we have seen increasingly a focus on form. Of course, there are some absolutely great buildings having been built at all times. This is one of the greatest I ever saw. that has actually been the signature now of a full continent, not only a city. But then, more and more, this idea of making something which was unusual in form started to roll around the world, and we saw more and more strained attempts to attract interest. If you can twist the high-rise, it's much better, or if you can make it like a Gherk, it's much better, or if you can make the highest, or if you can make it look like a palm tree from a helicopter, it would be a better place to live for everyone. I think that all these things are examples of that the form, the thing you can photograph and put in front on the front page of a magazine, has taken a lot of interest. But how these buildings function, how people fare, how the quality of life is in these areas are not really being discussed. And my point is very much that, as some of these other guys have said, as I mentioned in the beginning, that the way for architects to work has very much been that they make a funny building, they take some photographs, and then they run off to do the next building and take some photographs and move on to the third. In our profession, there's not a standard procedure of going back and see what was made, did it work, was the program fulfilled, were people happier here than in the previous one. The doctors would invent a pill, and then they will have 100 people here and 100 people here. Some will get the pill and some will not. And then 10 years later, they'll count how many had died. And then they know the pill helps. And then they can improve their profession and produce better things. I must realize that in my profession, we don't have such. We are artists. So we take a good picture and run to the next one. And actually, for 50 years, there's hardly been any research and science done whether these things are good or bad. There's only been ideological discussion, and from time to time we change ism from modernism to postmodernism to new urbanism to some other isms. And then everybody has to do other isms for a period. It's not based on evidence, it's based on ideologies. You go up and down in Dubai and look at the things, and the more I've been up and down there, I hate to be there, by the way, I realize that there's this great likeliness between the towers in Dubai and the perfume bottles on my wife's shelf back in the bathroom. And it is the same philosophy, let's make something which is spectacular so that the customers will notice us. But whether one house is better than the other is not investigated. You think that it cannot be worse? It can. This is an exhibition in Tate Modern about a new urban planning, and here is a fantastic city of biscuits and other good stuff. You think it cannot be worse? It can. Here is a new housing district planned by Frank Gehry to be erected in Brooklyn that is supposed to make Brooklyn to a much better place to live for people. But the people in Brooklyn, they are not convinced that if Frank Gehry comes with these crude things, everybody will be more happy. So there is this fantastic focus on the form rather than the content, and there is no systematic investigation of the consequences. Then you say architects are not interested in people. Wrong. Because every time any architect or planner hand in a project to anybody, to a city council or to a client, all the drawings are completely full of very happy people. We call it unspecified public life. That means people moving without purpose from place to place. It cannot be explained, they are just there. And all the drawings are full of this unspecified public life. Here is a new project for the harbor front in Sydney, and everybody in Sydney have come down here for lunch so that everybody can show it must be a good project. But now there is this thing that if there are many people around a place, it must be because it's a good place or they would go home. So we always put a lot of people into projects to show it's a good project, even if it certainly is not a good project. Here it's Harbour in Sydney. This I don't know where it is, but they are obviously very, very happy here. So let's build it. Here is from Ørestaden in Copenhagen, that if only we have had the 2 extra high-rise by Liebeskind, this dead place would come alive and there would be hundreds of people going aimlessly around in Ørestad. What are the reality? If you go closer to many of these projects, you will find that down at eye level where people are, you will find the most horrible scenes. This is a wonderful promenade next to the town hall in London. Have a good promenade. This is a bench by Rem Koolhaas in Lille, where you can sit and reflect about philosophy or Søren Kierkegaard or something like that. I hate to say that this is from Denmark, from Copenhagen, and here you can almost imagine you sitting there with your girlfriend and you tell her what a wonderful life you're preparing, planning together with her. I get so mad when I see these things because they have no feeling and understanding at all what is important for people. It's just something set, made in a studio and which may look nice on a model and is sold under some ism, and it's put there and they use money to do that. That's criminal. I'll invite you to a little housing area in Copenhagen. It is famous for being very dull from an aeroplane, absolutely uninteresting. It's so uninteresting from an aeroplane. It's called the potato rows. Oh my dear, potato rows. Here we are, here we are. If you're down in the helicopter and go over the rooftops, it's also very, very boring. Nothing interesting to write postcards about. But if you're down in the streets in this area, it has all the qualities you can ever dream of. We have a list of 12 qualities you shall ask for, and here all 12 qualities are present. And then if we look a little bit closer at this one, we find that not only do they have the highest resident prices in Copenhagen, they also have the highest concentration of architect families in Denmark. They're living there. And the head of planning in Copenhagen, half the professors of School of Architecture are living there. And the truth is that it's so nice to live there that they have no time to think about that from an airplane it doesn't look very interesting. But it's a really nice place to live. And if you have only energy to do one scale, then do the people scale. If you have more energies, you can do the helicopter and the airplane scale also. But people scale is by far the most important scale, and that has been more or less forgotten or it's abandoned, and there's great confusion, but it's bloody important. We know that now because of some of the science which has been made and some of the evaluation of projects which have been made. One of the good things, of course, would be to go to areas which are famous and have high prices and are esteemed and see what does this have which some of the new ones have not. And then we learn every time. After 50 years, there is now a distinct change of paradigm. Increasingly, we are asking for lively and livable cities. We know that we have to address the question of sustainability, and also increasingly we have to build cities which invite for healthy lifestyles. All this about lively and livability. We always had public spaces with people where we could meet our fellow citizens, where we could see how the society was organized and who else was in the society, where we could watch the girls or the boys or whatever we were doing. All this has always been a very important part of human settlements throughout history. The modernists very much managed to get rid of most of the life in most of the places. But we know now that whenever we make good people places, people will come. Because we are living more and more spread out. We are living in smaller and smaller households. We have more and more leisure time. We have many more years to live. And we have ample time and we have better economy. And the moment we have the option of going to nice people-oriented places where you are quietly among your fellow citizens, we can see all over the world that people would love to use these places, because throughout history, the greatest attraction in cities have always been not the architecture, but the other people. We know that we have to address the climate challenge, and the more we walk and bicycle, the better for the climate, of course. But also we have realized that to improve public transportation, we must make better neighborhoods and better public realms, so you can walk and bicycle in style to the station or the bus stop or whatever. So public realm and public transport, they're brothers and sisters. In the future, with all these 5 billion people living in cities, we must rely much more on, or entirely actually, on public transportation. And then it's very important that we have very good public realm, so in style and quality, and all times of the day and night, we can go to and from the public transport. Then finally, the health thing, that is more and more important. And we realized that for 50 years, we have more or less made city planning inviting people not to move at all. In America, there are cities where there are no sidewalks no more. And the only place you can walk is down in the shopping mall, where they will have a sign saying, you can walk here for exercise between 8 and 10 in the morning. That's the only place you can walk in some of these southern cities. And we have realized that the way we organize our cities and the way we organize the transport with cars, we can just live a complete life without moving. We also know now that if you only have an hour of moderate exercise a day, you do a little walking trip or you do a little bit of bicycling, then you will have a much longer and a much better life. And what is very important also for society, you will have a much cheaper health bill, because if people are not so weak and sick in the old days, it will be much cheaper for society. So we are increasingly seeing now cities having the policy, in this city we shall walk and bicycle as much as possible. And my point here is that if we look carefully after people in city planning, we will actually efficiently address both livability and sustainability and health in the cities. So the more sweet we are to pedestrians and bicycles, the better it is from some of these very crucial things. And if you look, no, I think that that explains itself in a moment's time. Are there cities who have such a policy? Oh, by the way, yes. Copenhagen was very fortunate. It survived the 2 world wars, and also it survived the planners in the 60s and the traffic planners in the 70s, and has been more or less preserved. And actually 52 years ago in this city, they started to push back the traffic in the center of the city. Nobody believed that the Danes would ever walk in the city. We were Danes, we were not Italians. We will not walk, we will not come out of the Volkswagen. And all this about urban life was not for Danes. Then they cleared the street, and next year we were Italians because we had space to be Italians in. And that was a big success. And then the city fathers, they gradually started a long process which have lasted now for 50 years of gradually making the city better and better for people. To realize how early this was, it was exactly the same time as Jane Jacobs was yelling over in New York. Then in Copenhagen, they were cleaning up the main street for traffic. It was the same influences they were addressing, but they didn't know about each other, of course. Copenhagen became the first city in the world where the life in the city was systematically studied and documented. We did it at the School of Architecture as research. We had this new pedestrian street, and we sat there for years and years and looked at how it was used and what happened if there were more streets and more space. We found that more and more people walked. The more you invite for walking, the more walking there would be. We found that more and more people would sit and enjoy in the city, and we found that the more space people had, the more people were sitting and enjoying in cultural events. We also found that the Danes gradually became more and more Italian, and that we only thought that we had a short few months in the summer to be Italian, but then it was so fun to be Italian that they expanded the season, and when last heard of, the season was 10 months a year, but now with the smoking law, we have a 12-month season, and we have no winter anymore, and we have learned and appreciate enormously to the public life and our public spaces. Copenhagen now is the first city in the world who have introduced a policy that we will be the best city in the world for people. And it's full of things we have to do. We have to walk more and spend more time on the streets and in the squares and parks. But they are doing what they can from the city hall to make it inviting and nice to walk in the city, for people to be in the city. They think it's very important for social inclusion and for democracy and for well-being and livability. Also, Copenhagen now has one of the first policies for being the best city for bicycles in the world. So they have these two policies, which I think I'm very proud of being from a city who has this kind of policies. Also, when we had the new government, they arrived up to the Queen on bicycles, some of them at least, and just asked the guard to look after the bikes when they went and got their commissions from the Queen. And no bikes were stolen that day. And there were no limousines until next day. But they're mostly in electric limousines now. But it was a fantastic gesture that the politicians who are going to be the government, that they bike to what they have to do as ministers. I was in Australia at this time, and every Australian news program showed these crazy ministers from Denmark bicycling up to the Queen. Last year, Copenhagen was again claimed world's most livable city in the Monocle, Monocle magazine. And actually yesterday, we got message that Copenhagen, again in 2014, has become on top of the list of most livable city in the world. And I actually see a direct link between all this people-oriented policy and being a livable city. I see a link here. Are there, any more? Yeah, this is not my mother. It is a Danish Minister of Culture reading in one of her favorite books. She told me she was going to be in an enquete with European cultural ministers where they should sit in their favorite sofa reading their favorite book. And she said, Jan, I took your book in English so they can see what it was like, what it was. She's just made a policy, architectural policy, putting people first. The previous policy of 5 years ago had a big building on the front page. Here, there is hardly a building. It's full of people. People should be put first in the architecture policy. Again, I'm proud to be from a nation who does this sort of thing. And it's not my mother, not even my mother. Are there other cities? Yes, there are. And this will be a very quick tour. Melbourne has for 25 years been out front there. They say, here we walk, here we bike. They have used the methods from Copenhagen to again record how the people was used, and based on this they can improve the city. The city used to be famous for being dull and uninteresting. Now it's by far the nicest city in the southern hemisphere. It is just like Paris, but the weather is better. Australia, again, Sydney, a little bit north of Melbourne. It's famous for its monuments. It can have Olympics, whatever, but the city center has not been very attended to for many years. People are having a really bad time in Sydney. That is being addressed now, and all the cars are going out on Main Street, and they are having light rail and bicycles and pedestrians on Main Street, Sydney. Sydney hasn't done so much, but they are very good in making posters. The whole city of Sydney is full of posters. We will be green. We will address the climate thing. You shall walk more. You shall bicycle more. They haven't done so much about it, but everybody knows that this is their policy, and they even say on the posters, you voted for that at the municipal election, and this is our policy. Great. Sydney will be coming. If we look at the last year's list of livable cities, you can see that Melbourne and Copenhagen always take turns in who are the best. And also you can see Sydney there. And I know that the 6 of these 10 have systematic studies of how the people use the city, and they use this systematic study to increasingly improve the quality for people in the cities. Some of the other cities also do it. I don't know it so much. In New York, the mayor promised we will make the most sustainable metropole in the world, 2007. They rushed over to Copenhagen to see what it could be like, and they were here for 2 days, and then they whispered, we want a city like this one. When can we start? I was quick. I said, let's start on Monday. So we started on the Monday, and they're Americans, so they are very fast. They are rolling out 5,000 kilometers of bicycle lanes in a fantastic speed. In 4 or 5 years, they have made 500 kilometers already of bicycle lanes, not only on Manhattan, but in all the 5 boroughs. And also, they realized that they had not enough. They had many people on sidewalks, but sidewalk was not big enough. And there were no benches, there were no sidewalk cafes, and there were no public spaces. There were no Trafalgar Square or squares like we have in Rome and Madrid or in Paris. And then they decided maybe we don't need Broadway for traffic. It was studied, and then in 2009, Broadway was closed on some of the most important points, like Times Square, Herald Square, Union Square, Madison Square. Here's Times Square in 2009 in the spring, and here is Times Square 2009, a few months later. It was taken over by people right away, and it was done as an experiment, and half a year later, the mayor came out and said, experiment? Times Square for people? No way. It's the biggest success we've had in recent city planning history in New York. It's going to stay forever. Now they are paving it, and just the other day I saw in the television that they had a big yoga class with 2,000 people on Times Square instead of having the cars. Great. And you know, Broadway, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Here they are continuing this motive of more recreation on Times Square. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Moscow. They heard about New York, and then they came and said, we would like to humanize Moscow. And they have a little problem over there because they really have let in far too many cars. And they have very loose rules about where to park cars. Freedom from communism is the right to park where you like. And that is not a very good policy in the long run. Here is Main Street, Moscow in 2011. Because they didn't have enough parking, they allowed that you could park on sidewalk Main Street. There was 1 meter left for people in a little small corridor where you can squeeze up along the front of the cars and get your coats absolutely gray from dust. not very good. The sky was full of advertisements. Then they approached my company, or myself, and they said, "How many books have you written, Jan?" "Yeah, we want to publish them all." And then they published all the books, or 3 of them, and that was the city of Moscow who published them. 3 months it was ready. The man who is very worried is the Danish ambassador. And I made personally sure that they read them. Then we were commissioned to do a study, for a systematic study of the life in Moscow based on the experience from Copenhagen, Melbourne, London, New York, and so on. We did this study. And halfway through the study, I was called up to the mayor to have a chat with him, and he said, "What is going to be in your report, Jan?" And I said, "Maybe parking on sidewalk Main Street is not what I will recommend for the future." Then I came back 2 months later. There were no parking on the sidewalks no more. That is because they have a very efficient democracy. Instead of the parked cars, they were full speed introducing planters and benches. And of course, some people had not really remembered that there were new rules for parking. But my friend, the mayor, he also has a policy for this. And they go up and down all the time now. And whoever forgets to, they cannot park on the sidewalk no more, they take the cars and they bring them to Siberia, I think. Anyway, you think this is very, very almost brutal city planning, but it's nothing. Because in Lithuania, in Vilnius, the mayor, the mayor is more radical, and if you forget your Mercedes in the bike lane, not so good. You only do that once. So, end of this story. This is the miracle of Moscow. This is Moscow last summer, and 1.5 years after the first picture was taken. Now, in 2013, all the cars have been taken off the sidewalk. The full length of the street are full of benches on either side, and the gray street are beginning to turn green with planters and small trees. And also all the advertisements in the sky has been removed, and now you can see Kremlin in the distance. To me, it's a fantastic miracle that Moscow can do all this in 1.5 years. And here you can see the mayor of Moscow sitting in an article talking about what is the route to a livable city. And if we shall end this part, I think that from Jane Jacobs started to yell in 1961 until Tverskaya in Moscow was humanized in 50 years later. It's a fantastic development, and that shows that these kind of humanistic ideas for city planning, they are getting more and more widespread. And I would say that maybe in certain types of city planning, we are starting now to have something like a scientific approach where we can control what is being made and check what the results will be. And really, the data is a key. We have developed these methods where we can study public life and have evidence and use evidence to show that your city is not as good as your neighbor city, and then you have good arguments for improving your city. These are some of the cities which to this day, in the past 15 years, this method of studying life in the city and using the study systematically to improve the city has been used. So, in that corner of architecture and planning, we can see that something has happened. And also I can see, much to my surprise, that my puny little book of 71 is now out in 35 editions, and it's coming out in Iceland next. And that's another sign that there is a growing interest in more systematic studies of these phenomena, which has to do with quality of life for people. I could end here, and I will end here, I promise. But this is a little reflection, what has happened in these 50 years. And down below, you can see a number of cities, and you can see my little book out there, and that's not because it's my book. It's about where have this kind of people-oriented planning taken hold. It has taken hold and been used in a number of existing cities where the problem is to clean up after the motor car, push the motor car back, and give the spaces to the people. The good thing in the cities of the past is they have the spaces. They were just invaded by motor cars, and just by pushing the motor cars back and organizing them for people, they can immediately be taken over and used by people, and that is happening in Melbourne, in Copenhagen, in Regent Street, in New York, in Moscow, every place. They can do this. What I see as a major problem is that all the new stuff we are still building are being governed by politicians, by people who are confused of scale, by architects who are obsessed with form, by planners and architects who have not learned much about people in their education, by developers who has the tendency to copy what was successful 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and then just put this up. So I see that out in the new districts, we have severe problem all over the world because all this is done without any systematic evaluation and science about what to do and how to make it systematically better. And so that I want that we, like a doctor's profession, could have some pills and give to these places so gradually we'll know how to make better places. But still I see a fantastic problem because we are expanding our cities enormously in these years. From 3 billion, we are going into 5 billion city residents in 20, 30 years. And we don't have the tools to do much better than we did 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, in conclusion, I realize that the world is full of brilliant designers, and I admire them very much and are a little bit envious. But we desperately need much better programs for what these designers are to design, instead of making silly perfume bottles here and there and competing on who can make the most funny bottle. So, research and practice, I think we shall have both. We shall have the artistic expression, but we shall also have research. We shall have systematic investigation of what we are doing and what works and what doesn't work, so we can day by day and year by year make better and better designs and better cities for Homo sapiens. So I come from a profession which traditionally has no research, but I do think that we desperately need research. We also need the artistic. Let's do both. Thank you.
So now it is time for questions. I see that Jan Gehl has probably many friends in the architecture profession, but I certainly enjoy the idea that, you know, there can be disagreements and that there should be a healthy debate. So the first question maybe over there. You go to the microphone.
Hello?
Yes?
So I was just wondering, with future retail being more and more on the internet, what do you think about the future function from the central parts of the city? If many of these retail shops disappear, do you still think people will go there?
I hope not to be confronted with that question. I do think that it's a major problem that we have at this time a major change in habit of retail, because the retail always were the ones who gave the economic basis for having city centers. And much of the retail now is being swooped up by shopping centers and by trading on the internet. And we can see in a number of cities, especially the smaller ones, the problems of maintaining the life in the city center. And I am quite sure that we cannot survive as Homo sapiens if we don't have cities with a living heart where we can meet. So we will have to find another economic basis to support the shopping as the one which economically supports the city centers. It is a major problem, and it's very much discussed around the world.
Other questions? If you can move to the microphone over there, in the middle of the alley there.
I'm just wondering, is the education at the architect schools better now? Are they talking more about people perspective, or are they still flying above models?
I hope not to be forced to answer that question. I would say that, as a general rule, I'm not impressed. I think that many of the much of the form fixation which I've seen in all these years are still around very strongly. On the other side, I know that now we are starting to have research and literature which can be used, and I know that a number of schools are using this kind of literature and doing exercises and research. So there are some signs, but still I think that the group of people who are most eagerly taking on these things are the citizens in cities, because they have been yelling very loud about having better quality of public spaces. And that's why so many cities have started to do something. I think that still the schools of architecture and planning and landscape architecture, they are lacking far behind in addressing this question of livability.
Okay, can you?
Yes, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. It was really inspiring. I'm wondering, as Scale Architects, you have, like you showed, offices all over the world. And you took part of departure here in Denmark, in Copenhagen. But now you're developing cities for people all over the world. I'm wondering, could you sum up the 2 best lessons you have learned, maybe from a project in Colombia or a project in Jakarta? What are some of the lessons that you're now learning from these very different places from Copenhagen? And then the last thing, I have a question also. Do you have a bike? Thank you.
The last question, I refuse to answer that. I have 2.
I have a present.
The first question, in this, okay, thank you. In this last book of mine, Cities for People, I think that I come to the conclusion that there's so much in common for people all over the world, that there are much more things we have in common than things which are different because of culture or religion, whatever. And my point is that we are all Homo sapiens. We have the same biological history. We have the same senses. We walk the same way. We can touch, and we have the same body. And I think that much of good architecture and good cities is when the body is comfortable and when you're following what is dictated by the body, the speed we walk, the ability of our senses. That's a very sure way. And I found that it's amazing. I've worked in the Middle East, in Amman, in Jordan, in Oman, and actually also in Riyadh, and never in Dubai. I always said no to that. But I found that in China, in Greenland, I found there's so many things, and all the basic quality criteria, they are universal. So there is an extra layer of culture, but all the basic things, so if you take the list of basic qualities, which is not only developed here in Denmark, but it's developed by studies in many places, if you take this basic list, that will also work in China or in Greenland or in other places, to best of my knowledge. That's my answer to that one.
Question here.
Hello.
I was just going to mention one more thing. That is the mayor from Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa. And maybe I should have said, and that was all, sort of the whole message, that I come from a profession where we have remarkably little science about what we are doing, though we have a fantastic influence on the quality of life for people all over the world. And I see this as a major problem. And I've been in this area for 50 years, and I'm so surprised that there are not more of us who do this kind of books and this kind of work. And that my little silly PhD can be all over the world, 40 years later, still in print all over the place. Is that it? Where are the other ones? And that made me quote the mayor from Bogota, who said, "It is interesting that we know much more about a good habitat for mountain gorillas and Siberian tigers and African elephants than we know about good urban habitat for Homo sapiens." And then I thought about all these nature programs in the television where you see from the lion is this big to this big to this big. And we have very little about people in the television, just to mention one. Why has this not been studied? I think it's too close to home. It's a little bit scary, people. Elephants are easier. Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's fine. Good answer. I'm curious about your views on unconventional uses of a city landscape that's not, that wasn't maybe intended by the architect. For example, skateboarding, how they take over the city in a way that's maybe not meant. Recently, the latest 10, 15 years, parkour, how they use the existing architecture and make more out of it than intended. And then as a follow-up to this, do you think architectures should have this in mind when they design cities?
I'm not quite sure I understood your question precisely, but it's something about if architects and planners think enough about young people and they need to do sports and exercise. Is that it?
Well, the examples I brought up is to skateboarding, for example, how they, in an existing environment in a city, they see something that the architecture maybe didn't have in mind. They see a fence here, or they see a rail there, and they use something completely different out of it than what was intended by the architect. And do you think this is something that the architects maybe should have in mind when they design a city?
Yeah, I tend to think that we shall think of all age groups and all kinds of activities. We shall be sure to make cities so that disabled people and elderly people can get around, so that the children will have a good time, but also that there will be special areas where people can exercise special interest in skating or other things. So you have to think of universally, holistically on the things and make sure, really be sure not to focus too much on one corner at one time, because we have to address the whole board of people's need.
I think the first question is here, and then after.
Hello, I'm Tatiana from Birmingham, not so lively city to be honest.
Would you speak a little bit slower?
Okay,
And
sorry.
that is also for the other ones, because sometimes it's difficult to understand.
So my friend Mitsui from Japan recently came from Tokyo, where she was not happy, to a nice small town in Ireland called Cork, which is fantastic for life. But in your list, the Tokyo was on a 4th place and the Cork was not even there. So how do you assess how livable is the city? What exactly do you measure or study? What are the numbers behind that?
Very easy to answer that one, because we've just published a book called How to Study Public Life, which is again the same foundation who came and said, couldn't you write down all your methods while you still remember them? We have written them down. They're out there in English and Danish and Chinese, major languages, and you can have all the answers in that one. How to study public life.
Yes, thank you for a very inspiring lecture. When you talked about the old cities, for example, like Rome, where you have this very prosperous people living in the city, one of the thing I was wondering is that most of these cities weren't planned. You didn't have this grand city plan for where this house should be and where this house should be. So I was wondering if you can comment on the architecture having a different role, going from building just one building to actually building a city. So whether this had an influence on these non-livable cities.
Yeah, I think that I mentioned it in my talk, but not so clearly. In the old days, cities tended to develop, to grow in small installments, one house at a time. They were developing along streets and squares, and there was a lot of experience in the cities about what would be a good space, what would be a good place, a good market space, whatever. And that was used and used and used. And so they were not planned, but there was a lot of experience and traditions around. It was a very big step when they started to plan from above, and everything had to be done in a studio. Actually, we can trace this way of planning all the way back to the Renaissance, where they started with the big boulevards and the big gestures. And the modernist, of course, is some kind of modern Renaissance planners. But there is really something important with the shift from building small scale based on traditions and sitting in a studio and building big scale. Because then you have to know a lot about the result of what you are designing. And my whole point here is that we don't know enough about especially how to do the small scale. We can make cities which look fantastic from the air, but we have great difficulties in modern architecture to do places which are absolutely wonderful down at eye level. And so I do see there is a problem here, that it's not based on tradition and experience. You have to learn it and know it and do it. It's difficult.
Okay, I think it is time to conclude. I think it is very agreeable for people who argue for more funding for research that Jan Gehl is asking that there should be more basic research in the field of architecture. So thank you once again.